Okay, so someone might say, I find it almost impossible to taper my drug. Can I replace my drug with another drug that's easier to taper?
Yeah, so there's this idea of changing to a drug with a longer half-life, because a longer half-life means that it leaves the body slower. So half-life is a measure of how long the drug stays in your body. And that might sound like a bad thing, the longer the half-life, but when it comes to tapering, it's good, because long half-life drugs tend to be easier to come off. Not problem-free to come off. It's not that they have no withdrawals. They just tend to be milder than the severe ones. So there's this idea that if you're on a short half-life drug, if you can switch to a long half-life drug, and that sometimes work. Like, I've seen it be a lifesaver for someone, for many people. But don't think of it as a switch. Think of it more as a bridge. Like, you still need to taper your original drug. You can just, when it works, you can introduce another drug, and I should say the receptor overlap, so to say, the receptor profiles have to overlap. So with SSRIs, and for example, you could go to fluoxetine. That would be the go-to drug because it has a way longer half-life. But for that to work, the drug you're coming from has to be sufficiently similar to fluoxetine, Prozac, for it to work. Otherwise, you would just introduce it would just give you withdrawal reactions from the switch. So don't think of it as a switch, because you would actually, and that's what sounds counterintuitive, this has to be done correctly for it to work. I should stress that. And you can find many stories out there where it did not work and actually make it worse, oftentimes because it was done incorrectly. So for a period of time, you actually have to take 2 drugs, which sounds like a step backwards, right? But just a tiny 3, 4, 5 milligrams of Prozac, fluoxetine, is enough because the receptor occupancy is so high. And then the idea is, once you've reached the part in your taper where even a very small reduction gives a blast of symptoms, then you could try to introduce this other SSRI, fluoxetine, and then give it a couple of weeks, and then make the same reduction as you did before. And then if it works, make the reduction that previously gave symptoms. And if at this time the symptoms are either not there or milder than before, that means that fluoxetine is working. So the fluoxetine is now it's now occupying the receptors, the same receptors as your original drug did, meaning that you can actually taper the original drug faster when it works. So you still have to taper it. You can just do it faster than you would otherwise do with less symptoms. And then once you're off the original drug, whatever that was, usually an SSRI or sometimes an SNRI, because these are the only drugs which are sufficiently similar, then you're left with fluoxetine, which also needs to be tapered, but that can generally go faster with milder symptoms. And the reason why we're talking so much about fluoxetine is that, like for antidepressants, that's the go-to drug. That's the only one that would make sense to switch to, provided the drug you're taking is sufficiently similar to Prozac. And you can read that, like that would be an individual assessment to make, obviously. And with benzodiazepines, we have diazepam as the equivalent of fluoxetine. So, and most benzos and Z drugs, as they're called, are structurally pretty similar in terms of their receptor profiles, meaning that going to diazepam, which has a way longer half-life than many benzos, it's completely normal when you take benzos continuously to have to take it many times a day with most of the benzos, because they're so fast out of the system. So in order to keep satisfying the withdrawal, the adaptation, so to say, well, 24 hours is too long. So you might go into withdrawal between doses, called interdose withdrawal. And to solve that problem, you have to take the dose multiple times a day with many benzos. Now, to solve that problem, because you have such a small window to be in, really, because the body will punish you with withdrawal symptoms within maybe 10 to 15 minutes of diverting from those times a day you take the dose. The solution to that would be to change it to diazepam, which has a longer half-life, and then taper that. Changing to diazepam can be really life-saving, and there's really many situations where it only makes sense to do that. Like, there would be very few disadvantages of changing to diazepam if you can, compared to tapering the original benzo. But obviously all this is not something you could do on your own. It's medical specialty to do that, actually make the switch. So don't play around with it, don't experiment with it, because we need to, the doses and the switches need to be timed very perfectly, and the dose needs to be calculated so that you don't make reductions when you switch the drug.
What about with antipsychotics? Is there any switches I can
So with antipsychotics, it's more difficult because they're way broader acting. They do, if you look at the receptor profiles of antipsychotics, they're very broad, very unspecific. So it's more difficult to find a drug that would not, by the switch in itself, cause withdrawal symptoms. That's why the drugs need to be structurally similar. Otherwise, the reaction would be the same as tapering too fast or just stopping cold turkey. So we need the drugs to be sufficiently similar. And that's why we're only left with Prozac for antidepressants, mostly SSRIs, and diazepam for benzos. With antipsychotics, it's definitely more tricky because the drugs are more different. Some people would mention Abilify as the go-to drug because it has a longer half-life, but the receptor profiles are more different between different antipsychotics, so I generally would not recommend it.